The wind whispered low through the cottonwoods, their bare branches like bones against the fading sky. Evening fell soft across the Wyoming plains, painting the snow in bruised lavender and silver. Far from the small town's flickering lights, a lonesome ranch house sat crooked against the horizon, its wood grayed by wind and memory. Inside, the fire crackled but did not chase away the cold. Calder Boone sat at the table, shoulders hunched, coat still on. The stew before him had gone cold, untouched. A tin plate, a chipped mug, and a folded cloth napkin. Laid out for two, though he was the only soul left breathing in that room. Across from him, nestled near the lamp's low glow, a photograph stared back. A woman with eyes like dusk and a smile small as moonlight. A childless bride, lost to the fever that had come early and left late, stealing her breath the day after Christmas, 2 winters back. He didn't weep anymore. Grief had done its carving, quiet and clean, like wind across stone. He spoke less now, moved slower. He fed the animals, chopped the wood, and drifted through his days like a man walking underwater. Outside, a snow squall gathered in the east. The porch creaked under the shift in weather. Calder stood finally, the chair groaning beneath him. He moved to the window and pressed one palm to the glass, watching as the wind lifted drifts into spirals. He thought of the years, 35 of them, and how little they'd left behind besides worn tools and quiet ghosts. Then came the sound. Not a knock, not footsteps. Just the flap of leather against wood as the mailbag, long forgotten on its hook by the door, shifted with the gust. Calder turned, blinking slow, as if waking. He hadn't checked it since last week, maybe longer. He moved with the unhurried weight of a man who no longer expected anything but silence. But there, nestled among the bills and winter catalogs, was an envelope, handwritten in dark ink, careful and crooked like someone unused to hope. No return address. No seal, just a thumb-smudged corner, and his name spelled plain across the front. Mr. Calder Boone, Broken W Ranch, outside Cheyenne. He opened it slowly. The paper was thin, worn at the edges. He read it twice before he sat back down. The woman wrote her name in the first line, Evangeline Hart. Said she'd seen his notice in the Matrimony Gazette. Said she wasn't much to look at, had no dowry and no family but a half-sister out east who hadn't written in years. Said she was 27, a former seamstress, and willing to be a wife in more than name if kindness lived in his house. She had written it plain, without poetry or plea. Just truth, spare, sincere, and brave. He remembered writing that ad. A letter scribbled in the hush of a sleepless night, after burying his old dog and fixing a torn fence alone in the rain. He hadn't expected an answer, didn't truly want one. But now here it was, a voice echoing back across the miles, soft and stubborn as grass growing through stone. He read the letter again, then placed it beside the photograph. His late wife stared at it, unmoved. The storm picked up outside. Snow swirled in tight dances across the yard. The wind tapped against the window like a child asking entrance. He didn't sleep much that night. Rose before dawn, shaved by lamplight, saddled the horse with gloved hands and a strange tightness in his chest. The train would arrive by noon if it wasn't delayed. He didn't know what he hoped for, only that something had stirred, a shift in the silence, a breath he hadn't taken in years. The ride into town was long and sharp with cold. Trees leaned against the wind, and fences wore coats of white. Calder said little to the storekeeper when he stopped for coffee, just nodded, accepted the thermos, and turned back toward the depot. The platform stood gray against the falling snow. A few folks waited, their boots muffled by the thick blanket. A boy dragged a sled. A woman carried a jar of preserves. Everyone looked like they belonged. When the train arrived, its whistle echoed like a song meant for someone long gone. The steam bellowed and curled, then thinned. Passengers stepped off, bundled, brisk, passing parcels hand to hand. Then came the last figure. She stepped down slow, guided by the conductor. Her coat was thin, her shawl soaked through. She leaned into the rail like her bones were made of glass. Pale lips, eyes shadowed deep in their sockets. She wavered once, then steadied. Calder watched her without moving. She looked nothing like his wife. Nothing like the girls from the dances he'd once been dragged to. But something in her posture, chin lifted despite the shiver, made his chest ache. The conductor called out her name like an apology. "Miss Evangeline Hart?" She looked up. Her eyes found Calder's, and in them was not fear or plea, but recognition, as if she'd known he would come, as if she'd walked through storms before. He stepped forward, touched the brim of his hat. She didn't smile, just swayed once more and murmured something that the wind stole before it reached him. Her knees gave out. He caught her. She weighed little, all sharp corners and hidden heat. He held her close, felt the fever beneath her skin. She was burning alive beneath that snow-soaked shawl. He looked down at her face. Eyes closed now, mouth parted slightly as if in prayer. A scar curved just above her collarbone, thin and pale as a stitch in linen. She had come too far, too sick, too late. He turned toward the street, cradling her as the snow softened the world. Folks watched, whispering. He said nothing, just carried her to his wagon, covered her in his coat, and drove home through the gathering white. Behind him, the depot emptied. The train screamed once more and vanished down the tracks. At the ranch, he laid her gently in the bed that once belonged to the woman he buried. Lit the fire, boiled water, crushed willow bark. Her breath came in shallow pulls, like a fish caught between river and sky. Night fell. He sat beside her, listening to the wind circle the house like it was looking for a way in. The fire cracked once, and she stirred. In the flicker, she whispered something, half dream, half confession. Calder leaned closer. Her name, one that curled like smoke in his mind, one that didn't belong to him. He frowned, but said nothing, just watched her sleep. Outside, the storm kept its vigil. Inside, something delicate began to form. Not trust, not yet, but the thinnest thread between two broken things that hadn't known how much they still wanted to be whole. And though he wouldn't admit it, not even to the silence he called his own, Calder Boone sat beside the fire with his heart not quite empty anymore. The wind had stilled by morning, but the cold remained, sharp and clean as a blade. Pale light crept through the frost-laced window panes, drawing ghostly patterns on the walls of the ranch house. Inside, the fire still burned low, casting long shadows over the worn floorboards and the narrow bed where the woman lay. She hadn't woken yet. Calder moved through the room with careful steps, each motion deliberate, as if noise might undo her fragile tether to this world. He brought in another log, fed it to the flames, and watched the light flicker across her face. Evangeline Hart. That was the name she'd given, spoken on the train platform like the last syllable of a prayer. Her voice had barely reached him, rasped thin with fever and wind. Now wrapped in wool blankets, her skin glistened with sweat, the fever still stubborn beneath her bones. He had seen sickness before, the kind that took without warning and the kind that announced itself slowly, cruelly. Hers was the second, a weariness that ran deeper than flesh. She was a puzzle he hadn't asked for, sharp cheekbones beneath hollowed eyes, dark lashes trembling against pallid skin. Her hair, damp with melting snow, fanned across the pillow like spilled ink. She looked younger when she slept, though life had clearly asked more of her than her years had earned. A scar traced the base of her throat, faint, thin, but unmistakable. Calder didn't ask questions. Not yet. He'd brought her into his home. That was enough for now. When she finally stirred, it was with a whisper of breath and a faint twitch of fingers. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpened in surprise. "You're safe," Calder said, his voice low, rough from disuse. She blinked, tried to sit up, and failed. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it gently to her forehead. She flinched, then settled. The tension in her jaw eased. "You collapsed at the depot," he said. "I brought you here." She nodded, barely, her gaze drifting to the rafters above. After a pause, she murmured, "Did you get my letter?" "I got it." He didn't say more, and she didn't ask. For the rest of that day, she drifted in and out of sleep. He kept the fire fed, brought broth she barely touched, and watched the snow fall in sheets beyond the window. The world outside seemed far away. Everything that mattered was within those four walls, a stranger's life balancing on the edge of breath. By the second morning, her fever had broken. She sat upright in bed, bundled in quilts, her voice thin but present. "I should have written again," she said. "But I thought if I waited too long, you'd change your mind." "I didn't expect a reply at all," he admitted. She looked at him for a long moment, then turned her gaze to the fire. "Then maybe we're both fools." Her words held no bitterness, just weariness and something like wry acceptance. He couldn't help but respect it. She asked little, made no demands. When he offered food, she thanked him. When he sat beside the hearth, she left him to his silence. It was the third day when she insisted on standing. He tried to stop her, but she waved him off with a weak smile. "I can't lie in a bed while someone else carries my weight." She made it halfway across the room before her knees buckled. He caught her, without a word, guided her back, and said nothing as she blinked back frustration. "I was stronger once," she said. "You will be again." Something in his tone made her study him, as if she hadn't expected kindness in that voice, as if kindness itself was a thing she'd learned to mistrust. By the week's end, she was moving more freely, quiet, deliberate, careful with every gesture. She swept the floor with slow, practiced strokes, mended a torn curtain with neat stitches, tended to the fire while he worked the barns. Calder watched her more than he spoke, not out of suspicion, but out of curiosity. Who was this woman who came with nothing but a name and a failing body, who stitched herself into the quiet corners of his house like she belonged? He learned she preferred tea to coffee, though she drank both. That she read scripture not out of faith, but out of familiarity. That she hummed when she worked, softly, almost soundlessly, tunes without names, as if only her hands remembered the melodies. One afternoon, he found her in the barn, talking to the mare like an old friend. The horse had drawn close, resting her head against Evangeline's shoulder. "You've a gift for calming skittish things," Calder said from the doorway. Evangeline didn't turn, "only because I understand them." He thought about that all evening. In town, people had started to whisper. Word traveled fast. The widower had brought home a mail-order bride, and she'd near died on arrival. Some called it charity. Others called it foolishness. A few wondered if she tricked him. Calder didn't listen. He'd stopped caring what the town thought after the funeral. One day, while chopping wood, he noticed her watching him from the porch. She wasn't smiling, but there was a softness in her expression he hadn't seen before. "You don't have to stay," he said without turning. "If this isn't what you thought it'd be." She stepped down from the porch, snow crunching under her boots. She looked thin still, but steadier. "I didn't come for a dream, Mr. Boone," she said. "I came because I ran out of other places." He nodded once. That made sense. More sense than romance or fate or any of the other stories folks told to make sense of loneliness. "Then you're welcome to stay," he said. She held his gaze. "Even if I can't be a wife the way you hoped." He paused, axe in hand. Snow fell around them, silent as breath. "I didn't hope for much," he said. "Just someone who'd look me in the eye." She did. And for a long moment, they stood like that, two people stripped of illusions, strangers still, but no longer entirely unknown. That night, he left the lamp on in her room, just in case. And when he passed the door later, he heard her crying. Not loud, not broken, just soft, private weeping, like something long held back had finally found a crack wide enough to escape. He didn't go in, but the next morning, he left a shawl by her bedside, thicker than the one she came in with, warmer. She didn't mention it, just wore it as she swept the floor, stitched another tier, and watched the wind dance over the hills beyond the window pane. Something was changing. Not quickly, not loudly, but it was there, steady as thaw beneath frozen earth. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between firelight and silence, between old grief and new beginnings, a story had begun to write itself. One that neither of them had expected. But neither had walked away. The fire was the only sound most nights, soft crackle, steady breath. Outside, The wind still came down from the mountains, sighing through the cottonwoods and across the frozen creek, but inside the cabin it was warm, the kind of warmth that wrapped around your shoulders rather than pressed against your skin. Evangeline sat near the hearth, a basket of mending in her lap, needle flickering like silver in the firelight. Calder watched her sometimes without meaning to, his gaze drifting from the journal he rarely wrote in anymore to the quiet curve of her brow, the stillness of her hands. She wasn't a lively woman. There was no flutter to her laughter, no flirt in her voice. She moved as someone who'd been trained to disappear, to take up less space than she deserved. And yet the room felt fuller with her in it. He'd learned her rhythms. She rose before dawn, boiled water, watched the sunrise in silence. She wore her shawl always, even inside. She folded towels into perfect rectangles and never left a dish unwashed, a task undone. But she didn't fuss. That's what Calder noticed most, how she simply did things, without comment or expectation, as if asking for anything at all might cost too much. They spoke more now, though not about themselves. He told her about the horses, about fence posts that needed resetting, about neighbors who kept to themselves but asked for help when snow drifted over their roofs. She listened, sometimes nodded, sometimes smiled in that small way she had, like something behind her eyes had warmed, even if her lips stayed still. It was a Thursday when he found her standing at the edge of the porch, hands curled around a steaming mug, eyes fixed on the pale horizon. "Storm's coming," he said, stepping out beside her. "I know," she answered, her voice soft. "I can feel it in my bones." He glanced at her sideways. "You always know things like that?" She shrugged. "When you've had to travel on foot, you learn to read the sky." They stood in silence a while. Then she turned to him, her eyes darker than usual. "You said your wife died in the winter." He nodded once. 2 years back. Fever." She didn't press, didn't offer the usual condolences, just sipped her tea and let the wind move through her hair. "I was engaged once," she said after a while. "Before the sickness. Before I left." That surprised him. She'd never spoken of anyone before. "He was a banker's son," she continued, as if telling a story about someone else. "Charming. He used to bring me chocolates in little tins, said he liked the way I looked when I ate them." She smiled faintly, without mirth. "When I got sick, he said it wasn't personal, just inconvenient." Calder's jaw shifted, a small, wordless reaction. She noticed. "I wasn't dying fast enough to be mourned, but not healthy enough to be wanted." She set the cup down. "So I left," before I could hear him say it twice. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't even tremble. But the air around her seemed to tighten, like the truth itself had weight. He didn't know what to say, so he offered her the only thing he could: presence. "You were strong," he said. Her eyes lifted to his. "No, just too tired to stay." That night, she hummed again while she stitched, an old lullaby, maybe, or a tune learned by ear in some city alley. He listened with his eyes closed, sitting in his chair near the stove, letting the sound wrap around him like a thread. Later, while she slept, he noticed the piece of fabric she'd been working on. A square of plain linen, patched carefully, not with matching thread, but with whatever had been on hand. It looked like a map, lines crossing, intersecting, unraveling, then tied back in again. It was beautiful in its imperfection. He didn't touch it. Spring thaw came slow that year. The creek began to stir beneath its ice skin, and the snow receded from the fence posts like a breath being drawn in. Calder found himself waiting for her footsteps in the morning, listening for the creak of the floorboards, the soft shuffle of her slippers. He hadn't realized how much of his quiet had once been loneliness, and how now it had become something shared. One afternoon, while she dusted the bookshelves, she asked about the carved box on the mantel. "It was hers," he said. "My wife's. She kept dried flowers in it, letters, little things that meant something." Evangeline nodded, her hands pausing on the shelf. "Did she know you loved her?" He looked down at his hands. "I hope so." A long pause. "I never had anyone who looked at me the way a man looks at a woman he's chosen. Not really. I've been useful, grateful, but never wanted." He met her gaze, the firelight catching in her eyes. "You deserve more than usefulness." The words lingered in the air between them. Later, as dusk slipped its blue shadow across the fields, Calder told her about his father. A hard man who taught him how to work but never how to speak, who measured worth in chores completed and feelings buried. He spoke of the way grief had changed him, not all at once, but slowly, like water shaping stone. Evangeline listened, chin resting on her hand, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she didn't speak. She simply reached over and touched his wrist, lightly, just long enough to say, "I heard you." It was the first time she had touched him without need or accident. In the days that followed, something shifted. She began leaving the door ajar when she cooked, humming louder, sometimes letting herself laugh. Soft, surprised, like the sound startled even her. Calder found excuses to linger in the kitchen, to hand her jars she could have reached herself, to catch her gaze a little too long. They didn't speak of love, not yet, but they spoke of seeds and planting, and how the hills would bloom wild in May. One night, while they shelled beans near the fire, he asked what her favorite season was. "Autumn," she said. "Things fall, yes, but they fall in color." He smiled at that. "Mine too." They sat in silence after that, comfortable and close, the shelling forgotten. Outside, the stars burned bright and sharp in the cold sky. And though no vows had been spoken, and no promises laid bare, Calderboone looked at the woman across the hearth, the woman with tired eyes and steady hands, who stitched broken things without asking how they were torn, and felt, for the first time in years, that something inside him was beginning to mend. The wind returned with the rain. It wasn't the lashing kind that tore shingles or split trees, but a steady, needling drizzle that soaked through wool and patience alike. The mountains disappeared behind a gray veil, and the earth turned soft beneath its weight. Inside the cabin, the walls held steady, but something finer, something between two hearts, had begun to shift. Calder noticed it in small things. How Evangeline no longer sang in the mornings. How her gaze drifted more often to the horizon than the hearth. She still cooked, still sewed, still spoke kindly, but her stillness had changed. It no longer felt like rest. One afternoon, while the rain tapped at the window panes like a child asking to be let in, he found her by the fire, folding linens. A neat stack, pressed with precision. When she looked up, there was something unreadable in her face, a quiet resolve that pulled his chest tight. "I was thinking," she said softly, "of leaving come summer, once the road dries." Calder said nothing at first. The silence stretched between them, long and taut. "You don't have to," he said finally. "I know." His hands curled into fists at his sides, not out of anger, but helplessness. "Have I done something wrong?" She blinked. "No. You've done everything right. That's what makes it hard." He crossed to the mantel, touched the worn edge of the carved box. "Then why leave?" Evangeline hesitated, then returned to folding. "Because truth doesn't stay buried forever, and you deserve to know what's been beneath mine." That night, he found her letter. It was tucked between the pages of the old ledger where she'd written grocery lists and notes about seed planting. A pale envelope, the ink faded and delicate. His name was on it, but the handwriting wasn't hers. He pulled it out carefully, heart beginning to beat faster than it had in years. He read the letter once, then again, slower. It wasn't from Evangeline. It was from his brother, Nathaniel Boone. The name caught in. The letter was dated over a year ago. Inside were lines full of charm and convenience, a proposal to a Miss Evangeline Hart, sweetened with promises and a few poetic flourishes. But near the end, the truth showed itself in clipped phrases. "I can no longer continue this arrangement. My family has other expectations. I wish you health and happiness, but I must withdraw my intentions." It was signed with a flourish. Nate. Calder sat back, breath knocked out of him not by shock, but by recognition. He remembered Nate's casual jokes about a girl who'd fallen sick, a mail-order bride he'd written to on a dare. He remembered the way his brother laughed it off when their father dismissed the whole mess as a near scandal. Calder hadn't known her name then, hadn't thought it worth asking. Now he knew. He found her outside, standing beneath the overhang, letting the rain touch her face like confession. She didn't turn when he stepped out, didn't flinch when his boots struck the wet planks. "You knew who I was," he said quietly. "I did." "How long?" "Since the depot," she whispered. "When I saw your eyes. You and he have the same shape to them. But yours held something different. Why didn't you say anything?" She turned then, not defensive, not afraid, just tired. "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought if I told you, you'd send me back. And I didn't have anywhere else to go." He studied her face, saw the way her jaw held firm even as her eyes brimmed. "Why come at all? If you knew the letter wasn't for me." "I didn't, not at first," she said. "I got sick after his letter came. Lost everything. My job, my place to live, what little pride I had left. Then one day, another Boone wrote. I didn't care which one. I just wanted a place where no one knew my name." Her voice cracked, soft as rain on tin. "I meant to leave after I got better. But then you brought me broth. And let me stay. And didn't ask anything of me. You looked at me like I was whole even when I knew I wasn't. And I wanted to stay." Calder looked away. The rain had soaked through his coat, but he didn't feel cold. "I should have known," he murmured, "that you weren't here for me." "I wasn't," she said. "But I stayed because of you." He closed his eyes. Behind them came the memory of her laughter, small and rare. The way she cupped her hands around tea. The way she hummed without knowing. None of it had been false. But it hadn't started true. "I need to go," she said, stepping past him. "I'll leave after the rain breaks." "You won't have to." "No," he said, louder than he meant to. She paused. I don't want you to go." Her shoulders trembled. He stepped forward, not touching her. "You came here under a name that hurt. That's true. But the woman who stayed, who planted things, who mended things, who healed without asking for anything in return, that woman is someone I want to know, whether she meant to come or not." Evangeline's eyes lifted to his, uncertain. "You're not angry?" "I was," he admitted. "Still am, maybe. But not at you. At him. At the way the world tosses good people aside like broken things." A long breath passed between them. The rain slowed to a whisper. "Do you trust me?" she asked, voice barely more than air. "I do," he said, "even if I didn't know I was doing it." She stepped closer, the rain light soft against her face. "Then let me stay. But not as a bride. Not until I've earned that name." He nodded. They didn't touch. Not yet. But their silence this time was full, not empty. Later that night, Calder returned to the fire. He held Nate's letter for a long while, then fed it to the flames. It curled, blackened, and was gone. And as the rain ceased and the coals settled, a strange peace came over the room. Not joy, not yet, but understanding. The kind that could build something lasting, if given the room to grow. The world awoke in gold. After weeks of gray skies and muttered storms, the morning broke clear and soft, painting the hills in honey and letting the damp fields breathe again. Mist lifted from the creek, like steam off an old kettle. Wild geese called overhead. Somewhere beyond the barn, a foal took its first trembling steps in the dew. Calder stood at the porch rail, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the light climb the sky. He'd risen before the sun, uneasy in his bones. Something had felt wrong in the house, too still, too hollow. Evangeline was gone. Her shawl no longer hung by the door. The worn boots she'd kept by the hearth had vanished. So had her stitching basket. All of it cleared away with a quiet hand, like she'd meant to leave without leaving a trace. He set the cup down and moved fast. Saddle cinched, rifle slung. The mare danced beneath him, sensing the urgency. He rode east, where the trail curved low toward the river, muddy from the rains, swollen with meltwater. The same direction she'd taken once before, on foot, half dead and chasing distance from something that wouldn't stay buried. The sky blazed overhead, but in his chest a different fire burned. Not anger, not yet, but a heat born of fear. The kind that comes when something you'd never meant to love suddenly becomes the one thing you cannot bear to lose. He found her by the water, slumped against a cottonwood at the edge of the bank. The grass around her was damp with river mist. Her boots were soaked, her skin pale as frost. She wasn't unconscious, but close. Breathing shallow. Eyes glassy. He dismounted and knelt, hands already at her shoulders. Evangeline. She stirred faintly. I told you, she whispered, lips cracked. I'd leave when I was strong enough. You left too soon, he said, voice breaking as he pulled her into his arms. She didn't resist, just let her head fall against his chest. I didn't want to be something you pitied. You're not. Or something you kept out of guilt. He swallowed. You're the only thing I ever wanted to keep. He carried her to the horse, wrapped her in his coat, rode slow and steady back to the ranch, heart pounding with every step. She didn't speak, just clung to the warmth, a bird too tired to fly. When they returned, he laid her in the same bed she'd once nearly died in. But this time, he didn't leave her side. He fed her broth, wiped her brow, murmured nonsense in the quiet hours of night. By the third morning, her eyes held clarity again. Why did you come after me? She asked. Because I've watched too many things die in front of me, he said, and I'll be damned if I let someone walk away while there's still life in her. She closed her eyes. You shouldn't have had to carry me. I didn't, he said. You came back on your own legs. I just kept you from forgetting where they were. Weeks passed. The river calmed. Her cheeks found color again. Her hands steadied. One day, he found her in the garden, sleeves rolled, fingers deep in soil. Planting late? He asked. Just in time, she said. Roots don't ask about dates. They just take hold when they can. She stayed. Not as a servant. Not as a ghost of someone else's mistakes. But as herself, quiet, resilient, and slowly, openly, his. Calder built a bench beneath the cottonwoods, and they sat there in the evenings, watching shadows stretch across the earth. They didn't speak often, but when they did, it mattered. One evening, he turned to her, nervous in a way he hadn't been since boyhood. You told me once, he said, that you never had someone look at you like you'd been chosen. She met his gaze, steady. I remember. Well, he said, voice low, I see you now. I've been seeing you for a while. The silence that followed was thick with feeling. I see you too, she said. Even the pieces you thought no one could want. The next morning, he went into town, quiet and purposeful. When he returned, he handed her a small box, no velvet, no gold. Just cedar wood, sanded smooth. Inside lay a simple ring, worked by hand. Not perfect, but made with care. I can't give you a name that's untouched, he said. But I can give you one I'll never take back. She stared at it a long time, then slid it onto her finger. They married beneath the cottonwoods, with only the wind for witness. No fanfare, just two people who'd survived themselves and still dared to reach for more. In time, the townsfolk stopped whispering. Or perhaps she stopped hearing them. There was a strength to her now that didn't invite pity or suspicion. Children brought her wildflowers. Old men tipped their hats. Calder's neighbors came around more often, asking advice, offering seeds, sharing coffee over long fences. The house grew into something else. Not just shelter, but home. On the first real summer evening, she stood in the doorway, hands on her belly, eyes soft. You'll be a good father, she said, almost shy. Calder came behind her, arms circling her waist. Only because I had to become a good man first. She leaned into him, and they watched the sun melt into the hills. No vows had promised this. No letter could have predicted it. But sometimes, what saves you isn't what you sought. Sometimes, it's what shows up in the storm, half frozen and broken, and stays long enough to help you remember how to be whole. And sometimes, redemption doesn't come on horseback or with grand words. It walks in on soft boots, carrying mending thread and a letter meant for someone else, and still chooses to stay. That was how love came to the Broken W Ranch. Quiet, steady, true.